Hi class! Today we are going to be giving a lesson on what the proper role for schools is in the promotion of democracy, and we're kind of going to walk you through our interpretation of the class and what we learned from it and how we can apply these things to this question. But first we're going to start out with the question that was asked us on the first day, which is how do you define democracy?
So, on the first day when Dr. Talbert asked us this class, I really honestly had no idea. It kind of made me feel pretty ignorant. But if I were to go back and remember kind of what I was thinking, I really only could link democracy to politics. In my eyes, it's basically just like the government of the people. So, like, people should have a choice in like what they do, what they say, like what they're voting on. Um, yeah, that's
Yeah,
basically it, unfortunately.
I kind of agree. I think that since I'm still not as educated on like politics as I want to be, as a person in society, I did relate democracy to just a rule of government and a system that is like relates to elections and the president and things like that. But I didn't define democracy in any way that could relate to education at all.
So first we're gonna discuss the difference between education and training. We discussed this the first day of class since it's kind of what the foundation of the class is built on. So training is basically preparing students for the real world and getting a job in the economy. So it's skills training, things like reading, writing, and math, which are obviously still important, but it's focused solely on that for the purpose of the student getting a job.
Yeah. Education is kind of the opposite of training. It's basically teaching students how to use the knowledge that they have to apply it to the world and apply it to make their own decisions. And it's more of a inspiring approach to learning. As students go out into the real world, they can still apply what they've learned and keep learning in the real world. So our first real assignment in this class was the text critique, where we analyzed the argument and the rhetoric of a piece of text. And this really allowed us to pull apart a full text and make meaning of it. We considered what the author was trying to mean, and then we could apply that to our meaning from previous context and then make meaning of the actual text. And we kind of related this to our high school experiences with text critique and just analyzing articles in general. In high school, we weren't really allowed to, not weren't allowed to, but we weren't encouraged to make our own opinions from text or engage with text with our own opinions. It was just based off of the common sense. And the expectation of the class was to follow the beliefs of what the teacher told us, what was true and what wasn't true, and how this evidence aligns with an argument. And so,
And also, oftentimes, like in high school, at least in my experience, most of the texts that we were analyzing were nonfiction. And nonfiction texts it's way easier to follow, like, what's the argument and then what are the facts or claims backing it up. Whereas in this class, I found it more difficult because our articles were like more journalism, they were more like opinion based almost, where it was like the claims are more embedded. So it was more difficult to kind of dig those out. I also want to talk about a little bit of another high school experience, like with rhetoric. I want to talk about like the American dream. In at least my high school, I come from a small town. It's like we talked about the American dream. We talked about as if that's real. And so it's like we would talk about the American dream and the teacher would say like, this is what it is. And this, it basically like that, like claiming that it's real. And so it kind of opened my eyes, like when we talked about ideographs in this class and how the American dream can be seen as an ideograph. I never really realized that.
So we just kind of brought up common sense in the aspect of analyzing articles and arguments and text critique. But common sense is basically the idea that we have our opinions and our arguments are true because they have not been questioned and they're just favored because they haven't been challenged at all. And this way of thinking makes us really ignorant to the fact that, as Talbert would say, everything is biased, depending on like your experiences, your cultural background, or especially your parents usually have a big say in the way that you think and your opinions, but it makes you kind of forget that they are your opinions and common sense is not always true or right.
And I think it's also important to remember that common sense or your opinions aren't, or your biases aren't wrong. Like, everybody has personal biases, everybody has opinions, and just because they're personal to you and your background, your experiences, doesn't make them wrong. What's important, though, is you can take your experiences and your biases, but you have to listen to other people. And I want to, like, use an example. Like, we have a friend, and he's an atheist, but he is super incredible at, like, listening to outside perspectives. He's a philosophy major, and he, like, will go to church with his friends, like, and he wants to understand other perspectives. And I think that's super important thing that we can take away here is, like, we all come from different backgrounds, but it's how you listen and how you reason with the world relates so heavily to democracy in our schools. We're gonna put our philosophy caps on.
And we're kind of going to enter the world of educational philosophies and into ideologies, but the three main questions that we took away from reading about philosophies were the questions of epistemology, ontology, and ethics, because these three big questions help us to shape our own beliefs and question our own thinking, why we think the way that we do. As future teachers, we want to use these questions to help us shape our classroom and help us show how we want to educate our students. We truly believe that as humans, we have the right to think what we want and believe certain things. And we believe that students are human, obviously, and that their experience in the classroom is temporary. Their learning continues outside the classroom, and so they need the skills to be able to critically think and make their own decisions using these questions. And we can do so in a classroom with democracy being promoted. So as students use or build these skills to be able to critically think in the outside world, that also can be a reminder that education and learning does not just stop in the classroom. Dewey says that traditional education, or what we would call training, does not connect to our outside lives. Rather, people make meaning of the world through their interactions and using these critical thinking skills to interact with people and with the world. And this relates to how the student life and the adult life are simultaneously connected. It's not just students learning in a classroom and then applying it to their later life. It's learning is an experience and it requires just growth.
There's this quote that we really liked by Dewey. It's the belief that all genuine education comes about through experience does not mean that all experiences are genuinely or equally educative. This also relates to the training versus education argument that we were just talking about. Training, even though it is like a form of education, doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best form or it's equally as good as some of the other forms that we've talked about. And an example of training or an educational philosophy that kind of goes along with training is essentialism. Okay, we're going to put our philosophy caps back on and talk about a few educational philosophies. So the first one we're going to talk about is essentialism. Essentialism is basically training, as we've been talking about. It kind of asks the question, why is a student going to school? And the answer is the student is going to school to get a job. They need to function in the economic world, and they need to know the skills or essentials to be able to do their job.
Yeah, and so kind of the opposite, another educational philosophy that's kind of the opposite of essentialism is perennialism, and it focuses less on training and more on actual education. And I have a quote from the Quant's text on page 76 about perennialists and what should be taught and how, and it says, all people, regardless of identity, background, or intelligence, must experience the same curriculum with the same educational goals because all people have the capacity to become fully human. And this kind of relates back to our three big philosophy questions. It hits on those as to what does it mean to be fully human, what does it mean to be educated, why are we learning, and this kind of is going to bring us into more educational philosophies like the ethics of care and the ethics of justice. So going into ethics of care and justice, the ethics of care is it just questions like the relationships that we have in the school settings and how we can build and maintain those relationships. We're kind of going to focus more on the ethics of justice, and this really questions the idea of what or whose interest the schools are serving.
So when I was student teaching, my teacher told me that she often didn't really have time to have class discussions, especially about things that her students were interested in. And this really, when we started talking about the ethics of justice, it brought me back to this because it kind of reminded me, like, who are the schools actually working for? It brought me back to like the training versus education argument as well, because if the like school is just focused on like standards and that's all the teachers have time for, that more goes in like the training side of things, and they're not allowing students to be able to critically think, which goes along with education.
Yeah. And so when teachers basically deny this ability to critically think, or like even like for the discussion, for example, like if you raise your hand and have a question about something and the teacher is like, oh, we don't have time for that, well, which is really unfortunate, but also if they're not like allowing any further discussion with other students or with engaging with the teacher, that has to do with the ethics of care and the relationship that the student has with the classroom and with the teacher and with other students. But this also goes into positive and negative freedom. So when we deny this interpretation aspect of things, we are denying the positive freedom for students in schools. Allowing students in education is negative freedom. With the ethics of justice, we are giving every single student opportunity to go to school, but we are denying them this positive freedom of being educated. We're giving them the right to get an education, basically get your degree and graduate and go to college and graduate from college and get a job, but we're denying them the ability to be educated democratically. So kind of going along with this idea of positive freedom and the fact that our schools don't promote getting educated, they promote getting an education and getting a degree. A really big concept of this course that helped us understand what it means to be educated was the political economic ideologies, because they really opened our eyes to, I would consider it like an adult, politics was an adult thing for my whole life, and so moving into my life after college, I have to dive into politics and understand the sides of it and form my own opinions from it. And these ideologies really introduced me to other people's opinions and how I can form my own opinions based on that, along with the ability to critically think about arguments made based on political and economic ideologies. But the understanding of the fact that how Quantz tells us that education is always going to be political, we can't escape that. But for me now, it's more coming from, we need to understand that promoting your political ideologies in schools will not promote democracy at all. But to find a balance between the left and the right ideologies to promote liberal democracy.
And it's important to remember that politics in school is not a bad thing. It's not supposed to be a question about the left and the right and who's correct and who's incorrect. It's more about students being able to understand like each side and form their own opinions. I mean, that's what democracy is, being able to think critically about things and form your own opinions. And I know for us, like coming into college and hearing, like, we're kind of like stay away from politics because
it's scary.
Yeah, we just like never really grew up talking about it, especially in school. And so it's important for students to not have that same experience and to be able to be okay with talking about it and forming their own opinions.
Yeah. So as we kind of wrap up this video, we think that this class is democracy at its finest. We walked in not even knowing what democracy meant, and now every student in the class is walking out with a different interpretation of it. And so this class gave us the information to form our own opinions and use critical thinking to apply our concepts of knowledge to our interactions with the world. And as future teachers, we want our students to be in a democratic setting, to understand that they should not believe everything that they see. We want them to use these skills to listen and analyze and question their own and others' beliefs, which will help them understand how democracy works, and then also how to basically balance their life through actively participating in a democracy, and then therefore help promote it to others. The role of education in promoting democracy is, for me, to allow students to use their knowledge to apply meaning to their own education and what it means to be educated using philosophical thinking, using these ideologies, using critical thinking, so that they can be successful in all their interactions with the world.
And I think in my mind, this class is actually a great example of how democracy should be implemented in schools. Talbert gave us materials, he guided us, and allowed us to form our own opinions. He gave us both sides of arguments, and we could critically think from there and kind of form what we believe. And one thing that I really appreciate about the class is someone could come into this class and they might not agree with anything to do with the class, and that's okay. And luckily, as future teachers, we actually got something out of it. But that is one thing I really appreciated. So in my mind, democracy is about engagement. Students should be able to wonder and critically think about the world, no matter what it is, without fear of their teacher having a differing opinion, or their teacher having a differing opinion than them.
Yeah, and also the thing is when we talk about, especially in my teacher philosophy statement, I really related to pragmatic progressivism, and I didn't really know how to implement that into my classroom besides just stating the basically the ways that the philosophy works. But when students want to go be doctors and they have to go to med school and stuff, they're learning all these facts and ways that the body works and the information that they need to know to be a doctor. But also this class and these promotions of democracy help us to be critical thinkers, and therefore when you are a doctor, you're going to have to critically think and make decisions about what's right in front of you in an instant. And like you said, democracy or these ways of critical thinking is not going to be right away. We're not going to be we're not going to understand everything about the world and be able to apply that within reason, but it's going to take time and skill to build the knowledge of critical thinking and be able to apply that.